Hello everyone and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start with the Namo Tassa as usual. Feel free to join in if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So again, welcome everyone to the Sutta class. Today we continue our topic, Skillfully Building Your Dhamma Practice. And in this mini-series, we explore different types of people, different paths of practice, different ways towards arahantship. And the reason we are doing this is because people are different, and I hope that you're able to determine which type you are. And so hopefully that will help you to select practices that are helpful for you and to choose the kind of practices that you do skillfully so that your path of Dhamma practice goes a little bit more smoothly, a little bit more easily, and you have less obstacles on the path and there are less frustrations. So your progress will be faster and your progress also will be more enjoyable. And the last 2 weeks, we had looked at different suttas and we have seen people are kind of divided into categories depending on the dominant spiritual faculty that they have. Especially we have seen the faith types, the vipassana types, and the samadhi types. And today we are reading another sutta that looks at a kind of the same types of people, but yet from another angle. So over time, over the weeks, we are building up this kind of knowledge from different angles and adding more details and so that we can get like a more complete picture of the practice. And hopefully that will be an enjoyable little sutta that we are reading today. Last time, a few people commented that their head was spinning because it was so complicated. And it's true, last time was a little bit complex, but hopefully you kind of were able to follow along. This time, it should be a lot easier. And the sutta we are reading today has a lot less complicated ideas. But I think it's still very helpful because it discusses some very concrete practices that people are doing in the various different types. So I hope it's a very practical sutta. And we are reading today the sutta that is called the Asubha Sutta. So Asubha, I think most people will be familiar with the word. Asubha practices. Bhante Sujato translates this as ugly. And this is in the Anguttara Nikaya 4.163. I've given you a link in the live chat if you want to read along. We will be reading from Bhante Sujato's translation. So again, this sutta is called the Asubha Sutta. And of course, people who are a little bit familiar with Pali will know that Subha means beautiful and Asubha means non-beautiful or sometimes ugly, but it's not necessarily like very, very ugly. It could just mean that it's not especially beautiful. And of course, most people will be familiar with Asubha practices, which are usually contemplations on, well, the undesirable nature of the body or other things that are not especially beautiful or a little bit repulsive sometimes even. So this is one kind of practice that we are going to look in a little bit of detail today. And I think we should just start reading the sutta and see where it takes us. And this sutta was given by the Buddha, and the Buddha says, "Mendicants, there are 4 ways of practice." What 4? Painful practice with slow insight. painful practice with swift insight, pleasant practice with slow insight, and pleasant practice with swift insight. So again, we have here 4 types of people, or 4 pathways of practice, 4 ways of making progress towards arahantship. And the first 2 kinds of practice are called painful practice, and the last 2 are called pleasant practice. So obviously they are opposites of each other. And then both of these kinds of practice, you could either have a slow progress towards arahantship, so slow insight, or you could have swift progress, so a fast attainment of the higher stages on the path. And when we look at the Pali text here down, we will see what is translated here as painful practice. In the Pali is called dukkha patipada. So the word dukkha, of course, can mean painful, but it can also mean like unsatisfactory or like difficult or unpleasant. So it's not necessarily a path that is physically painful. As we will see in a minute when this is described in a little bit more detail. But it's important to know that this is not like no kind of Buddhist path actually needs necessarily to be physically painful. So the extreme kinds of asceticism that we see, for example, being described as practices of the Jains or as practices of other non-Buddhist spiritual movements of the Buddha's time, this isn't really something that we find in Buddhism. So don't be misled when here it says painful practice. It's not that we are actually actively inflicting physical pain on ourselves. So that's always kind of unskillful, because creating more dukkha unnecessarily isn't really a skillful way of acting. It's actually an unskillful bodily or verbal or mental action, depending on what we do. So let's not misunderstand this painful practice as something that is actually physically painful. But it will be described in more detail in a minute. So let's just read on and see what the Buddha says here. And he says, and what's the painful practice with slow insight? It's when a mendicant meditates observing the ugliness of the body, perceives the repulsiveness of food, perceives dissatisfaction with the whole world, observes the impermanence of all conditions, and has well established the perception of their own death. They rely on these 5 powers of a trainee: faith, conscience, prudence, energy, and wisdom. But these 5 faculties manifest in them weakly: faith, energy, mindfulness, immersion, and wisdom. Because of this, they only slowly attain the conditions for ending the defilements in the present life. This is called the painful practice with slow insight. And what is the painful practice with swift insight? It's when a mendicant meditates observing the ugliness of the body, perceives the repulsiveness of food, perceives dissatisfaction with the whole world, observes the impermanence of all conditions, and has well established the perception of their own death. They rely on these 5 powers of a trainee: faith, conscience, prudence, energy, and wisdom. So far, the first and the second type are described entirely the same. Now the following part is the difference. And these 5 faculties manifest in them strongly: faith, energy, mindfulness, immersion, and wisdom. Because of this, they swiftly attain the conditions for ending the defilements in the present life. This is called the painful practice with swift insight. So here now we have the first 2 of the 4 types, the painful practice with either slow or swift insight. And here, finally, the Buddha, as compared to the other 2 suttas, in this sutta, the Buddha gives some very concrete practices that such a type would undertake. And so the Buddha says one of the practices that such a mendicant could contemplate on or meditate on is observing the ugliness of the body. So this is this is one of the practices that we traditionally know as the Asubha practices. This is described in more detail in some of the other suttas, for example, the Satipatthana Sutta, where we observe the different parts of the body, starting from the top of the head, going down all the way to the soles of the feet. And we look at all the various parts, the head hair, for example, the skin, the nails, the teeth, all the various inner organs and various bodily fluids that are in the body. And we observe them all as being not especially beautiful, as being somewhat repulsive, kind of squishy and bloody and messy. And we see that this is just an impersonal process, and the aim of this practice is to let go of our attachment to the body by seeing that the body is not a particularly desirable object, and it's not anything that belongs to ourselves, and it's not something that we should construct a notion of a self on that. So this is one of the practices that you could do if you are the type who has painful practice with slow insight. Another kind of meditation or contemplation that you could do is perceiving the repulsiveness of food. So this again is a practice where when we eat, we reflect before we eat, or even during the meal, we can reflect on the food that we eat. We reflect on the process it takes when it passes through the body, when like how digestion happens, how it transforms from delicious, nice smelling food into excrement, into feces, or even what it looks like when it's in the stomach, when it comes up again because we're sick, if we have to vomit, the way it looks then, the way it smells then. So we kind of know what food looks like, smells like while it is in the body. So we can reflect on all this. We can also reflect on the very long process and the amount of work that it takes to prepare the food, how it has to be grown, how it is such a laborious task to prepare the fields, to sow the seeds, to water the plants, to remove the weeds, to harvest, to prepare all the various stages of preparation, the cooking, like the packaging, the cooking, and so on. The amount of money we need to spend on food, how hard we have to work to gain that money, and also the mess that it creates when we cook, that we have to wash up dishes afterwards, which is kind of tedious and boring. So all these kinds of contemplations is what we could do in order to break our attachment to delicious food. So these kind of practices is what is called the reflections on the repulsiveness of food. The next practice that the Buddha suggests here or describes here is called perceiving the dissatisfaction with the whole world. So this is a practice where we clearly contemplate on the three characteristics of everything that exists in samsara. So anicca, dukkha, anatta, or impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and the impersonal nature or non-self. And when we contemplate like this, then we see that there's literally nothing in the world which has any kind of permanent structure, anything that has anything to do with a permanent self, and that everything is ultimately unsatisfactory. Even things that on the surface appear like beautiful or desirable to us, eventually we have to let them go, either because the thing or even the person breaks or disappears or dies, or because we ourselves die, and when we die, then we cannot take anything with us, so we have to leave everything behind. So ultimately, nothing in the world is worth clinging to. That is the perception of the dissatisfaction with the whole world. And even things that appear beautiful to us now or desirable to us now, from the point of view of an arahant, they wouldn't be desirable at all. From the point of view of an arahant, everything is unsatisfactory. Everything is ultimately dukkha, because anything that arises and that like draws our attention to the outside world, or even to a mental object, destroys the ultimate peace that you could have if you are an arahant. And because it takes away from the peace that you could have if there was no external object, that object is like less desirable than the peace you could have. So anything that is there is ultimately unsatisfactory from the point of view of an arahant. So these kind of practices are the dissatisfaction with the whole world. Then the Buddha also says we could observe the impermanence of all conditions. This is kind of similar. Here we focus especially on the first of the three characteristics, the impermanence, so anicca. And here again, we contemplate nothing is worth clinging to. When we pass away, we have to let everything go at the very latest. Most of the things we have to let go even before that. It's very similar to the dissatisfaction with the whole world, so I don't think I have to explain this too much. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. And another very important practice is the perception of our own death, so death contemplations. Obviously, these are not very popular in some Buddhist circles because it's very, very confrontational. It can trigger a lot of anxiety. It can be very unpleasant to think of our own death because it's tied up with a lot of fear. And it's also tied up with having to let go of the people and the things that we like. We have to separate from our loved ones. That can be very difficult to imagine. So that is why these kind of practices are called the painful practices or the dukkha patipada. And as we see, they are not physically painful, but they are mentally unpleasant because we have to focus so much on undesirable aspects of our experience. So all of these practices are done in order to break our attachments to the material world or even to mental objects. And for that reason, we have to counteract all this attachment. And so we have to focus primarily on undesirable aspects of our life in samsara and of our experience. For that reason, it is called the dukkha patipada, the painful practice, or the practice where we focus on the undesirable aspects of our experience. So again, it's not necessarily physically painful, but it is certainly challenging mentally to focus so much on undesirable aspects. And that kind of practice can be very draining. It can be very difficult. It can put you in a bad mood if you're not careful, if you're not generally balanced. So doing these practices is like you have to know yourself quite well. Sometimes it's very good to combine these kind of practices with things that give you energy, things that inspire you. Focusing, for example, on metta practices that generate also more pleasant mind states. But if you're this type of person, then this would be kind of your main practice. And then the Buddha also says that people who do this practice, they rely on the 5 powers of a trainee. And a trainee, of course, in Pali, this is called seka. And the word trainee refers usually to people who are at least on the path to stream entry. So the noble persons, the 8 kinds of noble persons, at least on the path to stream entry all the way up to arahantship. And if you are already a noble person, then you definitely have the 5 powers of a trainee, which are faith, conscience, prudence, energy, and wisdom. But this is not to say that if you're not a noble person yet, you don't have these mental qualities. It's just that they are not powerful yet. They're maybe a little bit feeble, maybe a little bit weak, which is why you haven't become a noble person yet. But these are 5 mental qualities that are very important. So you can also observe yourself, see if you have them. And if you don't have them, then you could also focus on developing those. Faith, obviously, is very important. Faith in the triple gem, faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, because this is what gives you inspiration to continue on the path. If you constantly have doubt whether this will work out, obviously it's very difficult to keep on practicing. And then conscience and prudence, in Pali, this is hiri and ottappa. These are mental qualities that keep you from doing unwholesome stuff, so keep you from creating bad karma, and they keep you on the path of the wholesome actions by body, speech, and mind. So for that reason, because they steer you away from unwholesome things and guide you towards wholesome things, and therefore they help you create the conditions for making progress on the path, for making good karma. For that reason, conscience and prudence are 2 very important aspects on the path while you are still training. And then energy, of course, is very important, especially in the beginning stages of the path, and especially if you do these unpleasant practices, because in the beginning, when we have a lot of mental defilements still and our wholesome tendencies of the mind are still fairly weak, we have to use a lot of energy to restrain our mental habits and to cultivate good habits, because this is not something that comes natural to us. Naturally, we would just follow the defilements because they're still so strong. But over time, as we practice more and more, the defilements become weaker. And so the energy that we need to go against the defilements is less. And our wholesome tendencies become stronger. So it's more like we can just flow along with our wholesome tendencies, and the energy that we need to extend while practicing is a little bit less. But definitely in the beginning stages, energy is a very, very important part of the path. And then wisdom, of course. Wisdom we've talked about many times already in the last few weeks. Wisdom, of course, is the thing that destroys the defilements ultimately. So the thing that breaks the fetters, or the quality that breaks the fetters, is wisdom. So whether you're a wisdom type or any of the other types, wisdom is always good to have. And by wisdom, we make progress on the path. By wisdom, we can let go of our defilements. And by wisdom, we understand reality as it actually is. For that reason, those 5 powers are very important. And then the Buddha says, the 5 faculties manifest in them weekly: faith, energy, mindfulness, immersion, and wisdom. So these are obviously the 5 spiritual faculties which we have encountered many times before. And now this part of the sutta is the defining factor of the first type of person, so the painful practice with slow insight. And they have slow insight because these 5 spiritual faculties are not developed very strongly. They are quite weak. So the progress they can make on the path is also quite weak. And we have seen last time already that different people have different types of dominant faculties. Some people have the faith faculty as the dominant faculty. Some have immersion, so samadhi, as the dominant faculty, and some have wisdom. But no matter which faculty is the dominant one, you need to have all 5 to some extent. So even if you say you're a samadhi type, you still need to have some faith, and you still need to have some wisdom. And of course, you need to have some energy and some mindfulness as well. So, but if those faculties are weak, then your progress will be very slow. That is what the Buddha says here. And he says, because of this, they only slowly attain the conditions for ending the defilements in the present life. So if you have the 5 spiritual faculties and they're quite weak, then your practice is quite weak. The karma that you make is quite weak. The mental tendencies, the wholesome habits that you build up in your Dhamma practice are quite weak, and they develop quite slowly. And those are actually the conditions that you need for the breakthrough to arahantship or for ending defilements. And since those faculties are weak, the conditions that you can put into place in order to make the breakthrough, well, it takes a long time to put those conditions into place. So your progress is quite slow. And then the second type is very similar to the first type. They do exactly the same practices, observing the ugliness of the body, perceiving the repulsiveness of food, perceiving dissatisfaction with the whole world, observing impermanence of all conditions, and well establishing the perception of their own death. So the practices are exactly the same, and they have exactly the same 5 powers of a trainee, but the 5 spiritual faculties manifest in them strongly. And because those 5 spiritual faculties are strong, they can make a lot of good karma in a short time. They can create a lot of good mental habits in a short time. So the conditions for the breakthrough to the higher stages of the path come together much, much faster than for the other type. So that is why they are called the painful practice with swift insight. And now we come to the types number 3 and 4, and they're called pleasant practice with slow insight and pleasant practice with quick insight. So what's the pleasant practice with slow insight? It's when a mendicant, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first absorption, which has the rapture and bliss born of seclusion, while placing the mind and keeping it connected. As the placing of the mind and keeping it connected are stilled, they enter and remain in the second absorption, which has the rapture and bliss born of immersion, with internal clarity and confidence, and a unified mind, without placing the mind and keeping it connected. And with the fading away of rapture, they enter and remain in the third absorption, where they meditate with equanimity, mindful and aware, personally experiencing the bliss of which the noble ones declare. Equanimous and mindful, one meditates in bliss. Giving up pleasure and pain and ending former happiness and sadness, they enter and remain in the fourth absorption, without pleasure or pain, with pure equanimity and mindfulness. They rely on these 5 powers of a trainee: faith, conscience, prudence, energy, and wisdom. But these 5 faculties manifest in them weakly: faith, energy, mindfulness, immersion, and wisdom. Because of this, they only slowly attain the conditions for ending the defilements in the present life. This is called the pleasant practice with slow insight. And what's the pleasant practice with swift insight? It's when a mendicant enters and remains in the first absorption, second absorption, third absorption, and fourth absorption. So this is exactly the same as we have just read, just abbreviated a little bit. But the practice is exactly the same with the 4 jhanas, going through the 4 jhanas in full with all the different factors. They rely on these 5 powers of a trainee: faith, conscience, prudence, energy, and wisdom. And these 5 faculties manifest in them strongly: faith, energy, mindfulness, immersion, and wisdom. Because of this, they swiftly attain the conditions for ending the defilements in the present life. This is called the pleasant practice with swift insight. These are the 4 ways of practice. So here, the third and the fourth type, I think it's quite obvious why this is called the pleasant practice, because here you go through the jhanas, so the deep samadhi attainments. And jhana experiences obviously are very, very pleasant. So 2 of the jhana factors are rapture and bliss, piti and sukha. Especially in the lower jhanas, as you move to the higher jhanas, the piti and the sukha, the rapture and bliss gradually fade away, but the mind becomes very still and very, very peaceful. So that's a bliss that is deeper than ordinary bliss. So that is still a very, very pleasant or very, very enjoyable experience in the 4th jhana, even though piti sukha have faded away at this point. As you see, these are just the standard descriptions of the 4 jhanas that you have seen many, many times in other suttas already. Of course, Bhante Sujata's translation here is obvious because he translates, for example, Vitakka Vichara as placing the mind and keeping it connected. Other translators have translated Vitakka Vichara as thinking and pondering, for example. And of course, I think most people who are listening in today will be familiar with the debate whether or not you can actually think in jhana or you can't think in jhana. So I don't want to go into this today because we have a different focus today. Maybe we can have another sutta at some point and discuss about jhana states in a little bit more detail. I just wanted to mention that if placing the mind and keeping it connected seems a little bit strange to you, this is Bhante Sujata's usual translation for Vitakka and Vichara. So I think it's quite clear, as I mentioned, why this is called a pleasant practice. And such a person who does the pleasant practice still relies on the very same 5 powers of a trainee that we have just looked at. So faith, conscience, prudence, energy, and wisdom. And we see that those 5 powers of a trainee are important, no matter which type you are, whether you're a wisdom type, a faith type, or samadhi type, whether you're doing painful practice or pleasant practice. All kinds of people, all types of people need the 5 powers of a trainee. So there is no pathway to arahantship where you can make progress without any faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, or Sangha, where you can make progress without any wisdom or without any conscience or without any energy. So these are very important for everyone. And also the 5 spiritual faculties obviously have to be present in any kind of Dhamma practitioner as if you want to make progress on the path. And again, we see that the difference between the fast progress and the slow progress is whether or not you have strong faculties or weak faculties. So that is, again, the difference. Even like also for the people who are doing pleasant practice, the difference is whether or not you have strong or weak spiritual faculties, and that decides whether your progress is fast or slow, similar to how it was for the people who are doing painful practice. So in this sutta, we have seen there are some people who are doing more the contemplative kinds of practices, which are called here the painful practices. And then there are some people which are more doing the samadhi attainments, which is here called the pleasant practice. So this ties in very nicely with what we have seen before, a distinction between people who are doing vipassana practices, insight practices, wisdom practices, people with a dominant wisdom faculty. So for them, the mind will naturally incline towards doing contemplations, towards developing their wisdom faculty, towards understanding reality as it actually is. And then on the other hand, we have seen in the last few weeks, the other type, the samadhi type. These are people whose mind naturally inclines to stillness and to calmness and to tranquility. So those are people who can easily develop the jhanas. And here in this sutta, those kind of people are not called the stillness people or the stillness types. They're called the pleasant types or the pleasant kinds of practice. But the concepts or the distinction between the vipassana type and the samatha type is also quite clearly visible here. So we see that there are some differences in the way they practice. Some differences, like different practices are mentioned here, but there are also some similarities. For example, all of them need to develop the 5 powers of a trainee, and all of them need to develop the 5 spiritual faculties. And I really appreciate this sutta because it does give us some very concrete practices that you can do if you are a samatha type or a vipassana type. For the samatha type, I think it has always been fairly clear that those are types that are doing the jhana practices. But for the vipassana types, so far we haven't really seen very concrete examples of practice. But here in this sutta, They are mentioned, such as perceiving the repulsiveness of the body, the repulsiveness of food, death contemplations, non-delight in the entire world, and so on. So I think it's very helpful that here finally the sutta mentioned some very specific things that are suitable for the different types. So hopefully this sutta was beneficial. Hopefully this shed some more light on the different types that we have been exploring over the next few weeks. Next week, we will have one more sutta on this topic where we will look at similar aspects from yet another different angle, adding a little bit more information again. And at this point, I'm going to end the sutta discussion for today. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the live chat, and I will see if I can answer them. So far, I just see a lot of emojis, and I see a lot of sadhus. I don't see any questions so far. So I'll give you another minute or so to see if you want to type anything. So while we wait, I can let you know I just moved to a new place yesterday. I'm now staying in Berlin, Germany, in a very beautiful small Dharma center that is run by a Mahayana nun practicing in the Chinese Chan or Chinese Zen tradition called Chan tradition. And we are trying to build up a new small forest monastery. And so that is what we will be doing over the next few weeks and months. If anyone is in Germany or is in Berlin, feel free to drop by. We're always happy to see people. We are still open to the public, even though there is COVID and there is the pandemic at the moment, we can still open. So if you are close by, send us a message and see if you can drop by. It would be nice to see you. And I see that a question has popped up in the live chat. And Parag asks, what is the difference between the fast and the slow versions of the pleasant practices? So the difference between the fast and the slow versions in both the pleasant and the painful practices is the same difference, which is whether or not your spiritual faculties, the 5 faculties, are strong or weak. So the 5 spiritual faculties, these are faith, energy, mindfulness, samadhi, and wisdom. And if they are weak, then your progress on the path will be quite weak, because it takes you a long time to build up wholesome habits. It takes you a long time to make good karma. It takes you a long time to develop your meditation practice because those faculties are weak. And because it takes you a long time to put all these conditions into place, the breakthrough to the higher stages on the path also takes longer, because you have to have all conditions in place before you can make the breakthrough. But if those spiritual faculties are strong, then you can make good karma very quickly. You can build up new wholesome habits very quickly. You can quickly make insights, and you can quickly abandon defilements. So the path develops much more quickly, and you can attain the higher stages on the path also much more quickly. And Gita says she was wondering if I've left my parents. Yes, I just visited my parents the last few weeks because I haven't seen them for quite a few years, but now I have left. And God asks, how to develop the energy faculty? Well, the most important thing is the inspiration that you have in the practice. So if you're motivated, if you're doing something that interests you, naturally you will have energy because you want to do what you're doing. If your practice is boring and it's very difficult for you, then it's kind of difficult to find the motivation. You won't have the energy. You'll be kind of sleepy. You'll be bored. Your mind will just incline to other things, and it will be very difficult to find the energy to practice. So for that reason, it's important to understand what kind of type you are, because if you know whether you're a wisdom type or a samadhi type or a faith type, then you can choose practices that are actually interesting for you and that are suitable for you and that rely on the strength that you already have. So nobody starts from zero. Everybody has a little bit of wisdom already, a little bit of faith, a little bit of wholesome qualities in their mind. But those wholesome qualities can vary from person to person. So if you make use of your particular wholesome qualities, that will be much easier. So finding out which type you are, choosing practices skillfully, doing things that inspire you, it will be very helpful because those practices will give you the energy that you need. And that can be different from person to person. Some people get very inspired when they meet other Dhamma practitioners. Some people get very inspired when they meet monastics. Other people get inspired when they read Dhamma teachings or when they read the suttas. Other people get inspired when they do chanting because it's very beautiful and calming and inspirational. Other people can get inspired if they have the opportunity to help others or to give dana or to share things with others. Some people thrive in communities of Dhamma practitioners. Other people like to do things on their own. So it really depends from person to person what will be suitable conditions for you. So it's important that you get to know yourself and figure out what is helpful. Because there can be so many different pathways, which is why we are doing this series of talks to see that people are different and that practices are different. So think about what inspires you on the Dhamma path, and then do more of that to build up a wholesome momentum and to build up the energy, and then focus on practices that are suitable for your particular type. And Sui has a question that is a little bit taking us away from this sutta. So these kind of questions are actually better for monk chat. But since we have time today, I will just give a quick answer. So Sui says that they feel jealous of their husband, and what kind of meditation would be helpful for that. So usually the direct antidote to jealousy is mudita practices, so rejoicing in the goodness of others. So when we are jealous, we are angry if good things happen to others. So we wish for others not to be that happy. But when we practice mudita, then we rejoice in all the good things that happen to others. So this is the direct opposite of the mind state of jealousy. So actively contemplating all the good things that happen to the person that you're jealous of, in this case, to your husband, rejoicing that he's happy, that good things are happening to him. Even also contemplating all the good things that the two of you did together, maybe strengthening your own relationship with the husband. These kind of contemplations will be very helpful in order to counter jealousy. And if mudita practices are still a little bit difficult for you, just doing general metta practices and metta directed towards your husband can also be helpful. So P. Gurgle Sigrillo asks, recently I've received the advice to read the suttas for inspiration instead of information. Could you speak a bit about this? Well, it depends very much which type of person you are. If you are the faith type, or even maybe the samadhi type to a lesser extent, but especially the faith type, then reading suttas for inspiration is exactly the right thing to do, because inspiration and faith are very closely linked together. And strengthening your dominant faculty, so the faith faculty, will be very, very helpful for you on the path. So reading suttas for inspiration is very helpful. And that can also be very helpful for samadhi types, because samadhi types rely a lot on developing piti sukha, so happiness and bliss, or rapture and bliss, depending on the translation. So reading suttas and bringing up this feeling of happiness and bliss is extremely helpful also for samadhi types. But if you are a wisdom type, then you're reading suttas for information, not for inspiration, because that will strengthen your dominant faculty, the wisdom faculty. So again, it depends which type you are. If you're a wisdom type, read for information. If you are a samadhi type or a faith type, then read for inspiration. And Aum asks, please share your practice in relation to this sutta. So before I share my practice, the first thing to remember is that the whole premise of this series of talks is that everybody is different, and that comparing yourself to others is not that helpful, because it's very likely that they are a different type and that they have different mental qualities, both wholesome and unwholesome different qualities. So you have to really make this path your own. Of course, if other people share their stories, that can be inspirational. That can also give you some food for thought, things that you could incorporate into your own practice. But just be careful when you compare, because you are different from everybody else and you have to make the path your own. So my own practice, I think, is I'm more of a wisdom type. So in terms of this sutta, my mind inclines a little bit more to the painful practices, so the contemplations and the development of wisdom and the insight into things as they actually are, rather than the samadhi types. But as I mentioned before, if you, no matter which faculty is your dominant faculty, as you practice and as your practice makes progress, eventually all the other faculties also develop. So for example, for a wisdom type such as myself, as you make a little bit of progress, the defilements get weaker. You have less defilements in your mind. Since you have less defilements in your mind, the mind naturally becomes more calm, becomes more still. And samadhi then develops as a byproduct of wisdom. So it's not that if you're, for example, a wisdom type, you never have any samadhi. It's just that it takes a little bit longer to develop. And vice versa. For example, if you're a samadhi type, it's not that you don't have any wisdom. As your mind becomes more calm and more still, because you're doing samadhi practices, the mind is so clear that your wisdom faculty also can make insights, even though it's a little bit weaker. And because you also make insights, you can abandon defilements. And so over time, you also destroy the fetters and make progress on the path. So for that reason, all of the practitioners have all the 5 faculties. It's just that one of them is dominant. And by relying on that, our progress becomes a little bit faster and a little bit more smooth. So, and Aum says that their family is in Berlin. Oh, that's very nice. What is your monastery called? The monastery is called Miao Fa Center. And maybe I can put a link in the live chat for people who want to see. Just give me a minute to find the website. So I have put the link in the live chat. If the website comes up in German, obviously there's also an English version, so you can also read everything in English if you want to. And Piyal and Indira Valpola ask, does pleasant practice happen only with awareness release? So pleasant practice is a whole practice path from the beginning to the end. So awareness release obviously is a very high state that you develop only towards the very end of the path. But the pleasant practice can happen all the way. So for some people, samadhi practices are not that difficult. Some people actually have access to samadhi states relatively early on in the path already. So you can have jhana states already, but you don't have awareness release yet. And Rampal asks how to concentrate on studies. Well, you concentrate on studies just the same way that you concentrate on anything else, by taking an interest and then focusing your mind on that. And if you're inspired by a certain topic, then it's quite easy to focus on that and to concentrate on that. But if you think the topic is boring, then obviously your mind doesn't incline there and you will not be able to actually concentrate on anything. So it's important that you find parts of Buddhist practice that are inspiring to you, that interest you, or where you can find the motivation fairly easily to practice in that way. And as your practice makes progress, you will see that naturally your interest in the practice increases, because you see that you have all the benefits from the practice. So your motivation increases, and then your concentration on the various areas of Buddhist studies also becomes stronger. So take an interest and start from those places of Buddhist practice where you feel naturally drawn to, where you can feel inspiration and motivation. And Sud asks, should we stick to one type of meditation, such as mindfulness of the body, versus mix and match? Breath and loving kindness and Buddhanussati, etc. What if one of the types of meditation is easier? So this is something we will discuss in a lot of detail next time, but I will give a brief answer today. So first of all, if you need to find out, are you a wisdom type, are you a samadhi type, or are you a faith type? Then practice the kind of meditation that is suitable for your type. But even within one type, say for example you're a wisdom type, there are different kinds of wisdom practices, as we have seen today. The Buddha mentioned quite a list. For example, repulsiveness of the body, non-delight in the entire world, repulsiveness of food. And actually there are also vipassana practices that are less difficult to do, that are less unpleasant to do. Just observing the body, for example, without too much reflection on the repulsive nature of the body could be a vipassana practice. So even within one broad area of meditation, such as vipassana practice or even samatha practice, there's still different aspects to that. For example, even for elements practice could be a vipassana practice. Investigating the 5 khandhas or the 6 sense spaces could be a vipassana practice. Reflecting on dependent origination could be a vipassana practice. So there are various different areas. Even if you know you're, say, a wisdom type, there are many different areas where you could practice. If you are a samadhi type, still there's a wide range of different samadhi objects that you could practice with, not only the breath, not only the body. For example, there are kasina practices. There's just a very wide range of different samadhi objects. Even metta meditation is a samadhi object if you use it that way. So it's just a very wide range of practices that you could do. But you need to know your type and choose a practice that is suitable for that particular type. Then mixing and matching is sometimes necessary. So this is something we'll discuss a lot next week. But briefly speaking, even if you generally say a wisdom type or you're generally a samadhi type, the mind changes every day. And on some days, say you're a wisdom type, but on some days you just feel very agitated. So you should probably do a calming practice first. And a calming practice will usually be a samatha focused practice. Just focusing on the breath, or just doing a little bit of metta or something like this. Or if you are a samadhi type, but your mind is very, very sleepy one day, then doing more calming practices probably will not be all that helpful. So doing a little bit of a more active kind of meditation, a little bit of a contemplation, for example, just to wake up your mind, to make it a little bit more energetic, could be helpful in that case. So it really depends both on your type and on the mental state in that particular moment, which kind of practice would be helpful. And again, we have a sutta next week that discusses this in a lot of detail, so I'm not going into, I'm not giving a long explanation now. And what if one type of the meditation is easier? Usually the type of meditation that is easier for you is the type that is suitable for your particular dominant spiritual faculty. So if you are samadhi type, then samadhi practices should be easier for you. If you are a vipassana type, then vipassana practices should be easier for you. If you're a faith type, then devotional practices should be easier for you. So by figuring out which kind of practice is the easier one for you, this can give you a very strong hint which kind of type you are. And of course, then you can focus on doing that kind of practice. And Pial and Indira ask, can you say wisdom practice leads to discernment release, whereas samadhi practice leads to awareness release? In some way, I guess you could say that. Yeah, I think you could potentially say that. And I think we have come to the end of the questions. And we've also come to the end of our 1 hour that is allocated for the sutta study. So we can finish up for today with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I will see you all next week. Have a nice rest of the day and have a nice weekend.